Let's talk now about bands from the first half of the 1970s that continue to pretty much do what they were doing in the first half of the 70s into the next half, the second half of the 1970s. So this video is really about continuities across the decade. Let's start with groups that were in the first half of the 70s, had already been stars or had success in the 60s. Let's start with the Rolling Stones. In the middle of the decade, 1975, Mick Taylor, who'd played with the group for the first half of the decade, was out, lead guitar player. And Ron Wood, who'd been with the Faces, Rod Stewart, was in. And they released an album in 1976, a #1 album called Black and Blue, the big single on that, Fool to Cry. Rolling Stones continued to have fantastic chart success in the second half of the 1970s. Some Girls was a #1 album from 1978. The big tracks from that album, Beast of Burden, Miss You. Miss You, interestingly, depending on whose story you believe, either started out trying to be a disco song or just became a disco song. But when I mentioned before that a lot of rock acts in the second half of the 70s did a disco number, this would count as the Rolling Stones disco number. And then by 1980, still a #1 album with Emotional Rescue. So the Rolling Stones still very much in the game here in the second half of the 70s. This is all through everything that happens with punk and disco and new wave that we will talk about or have talked about. The Rolling Stones still at the top of the charts. Well, we've talked about the Rolling Stones. What about the Beatles? And of the groups, of the Beatle members in the second half of the 70s, Paul McCartney was far and away the most commercially successful of those members. Ringo Starr had a pretty good first half of the 70s, but the second half of the 70s weren't so good for him. George Harrison came back with 33 1/3, which was kind of a comeback album for him, but not a big blockbuster. John Lennon was sort of officially retired, hanging out in his New York apartment, raising his son and being a kind of house husband. He comes back in 1980 with the album Double Fantasy, but then unfortunately is murdered in December of 1980. And you know, if there was a day the music died for the 70s, that might be one. Of course, the big song off that album, Just Like Starting Over. But in the time since, there's hardly a song off that album that hasn't gone into heavy rotation. But Paul McCartney and Wings, what a fantastic string of success Paul McCartney had. Imagine you're Paul McCartney and you have all the success he had in the 70s, and people still say, but yeah, you know, not quite like the Beatles. Most bands would kill to have the success Paul had with any one of those albums in the 70s, but Paul McCartney, because he'd been in the Beatles, Wings was always kind of an also-ran group in his career. But what a fantastic amount of success. Band on the Run, a #1 album from 1974 with that title track, Band on the Run and Jet. Wings at the Speed of Sound, 7 weeks at #1 in 1976. Silly Love Songs, the song on that, which is actually Paul's response to people who have criticized him for always, or having the tendency sometimes to write songs that are a little bit sort of frivolous, cute love songs. So he writes a song asking what's so bad about silly love songs. And his #1 album from 1978, London Town, which has a #1 hit on it, With a Little Luck. So a very good second half of the 1970s for Paul McCartney. Another person who had some success in the 60s is Steve Miller. The Steve Miller Band had San Francisco roots from the late 1960s, was moving in the same circles as the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, groups like that. In 1973, his album The Joker and the song of the same name had pretty good success. But he really the sort of emblematic album probably for Steve Miller from the 70s is from 1976. It's called Fly Like an Eagle. Gosh, there's hardly a bad track on that album, or not so much, not a bad track, but they're all really good tracks. The title track itself, Rockin' Me, Baby, and Take the Money and Run, all really interesting music from Steve Miller, and some fantastic Hammond organ playing for those of you who are connoisseurs of Hammond organ and keyboard playing. We didn't mention the Doobie Brothers in week 1 because I was saving them for this week. The Doobie Brothers also coming out of San Francisco. The group sort of falls into 2 stages of their career, one in the first half of the 70s and the other in the second half of the 70s. In the first half of the 70s, they're fronted by a lead guitar player, singer by the name of Tom Johnston. And so songs like Listen to the Music from 72 and Long Train Runner from 73 are Tom Johnston on lead vocals, lead guitar, along with Patrick Simmons and than the rest of the guys. But then Johnston has some health problems. He needs to get off the road. He can't really sort of keep up the rigors of touring and all that. And so they go through some changes and eventually bring in singer and keyboard player Michael McDonald. And in the second half of the 70s, with a different sound, a sound that's maybe veers away from the sort of blues rock, blue-eyed soul of what they'd done in the first half of the 70s and heads more toward jazz, the jazz-influenced music of groups like Steely Dan. They have a couple of big records with Michael McDonald on lead vocals, Taking It to the Streets from 1976, and then the big album, Minute by Minute, which was a big #1 album in 1979. That was a fantastic record in many ways. And of course, Michael McDonald goes on to his own solo career after that. There were also some new bands in the second half of the 70s that really continued in traditions that had been started in the 70s, the first half of the 70s. So let's take a look at some of those. Certainly one of the most important of those is this group, Boston, led by guitarist, songwriter, recording engineer Tom Scholz, also a guy who had a degree from MIT in engineering and had worked with Polaroid to develop photographic processes and things like that. That first album, Boston, from 1976, a #3 record, is still thought of as one of the most astoundingly successful debut albums in the history of recorded music. What's interesting is to see some of the elements they're drawing in. For example, the big song, More Than a Feeling, which is one of the kind of iconic rock ballad pieces from the 70s, uses not only the sort of mellow acoustic guitar, but when it gets into the big sections, the guitar parts and the music are especially symphonic. The whole center section is instrumental. The whole contrasting section in the center is instrumental. You get these sort of harmony guitars that sound like they're drawn from Brian May of Queen. It's a very big sounding number with a lot of kind of drama, all fit into like a 5-minute frame. Also the song Foreplay Long Time, the whole beginning of Foreplay, very much taking a page from the Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, King Crimson, Genesis kind of playbook with all the sort of classically sounding organ. You get a bunch of that in the middle of the song Smokin' from the same album as well. So you can see these prog elements being brought in ways that were not, the song could not be thought of as progressive rock tunes, but they're bringing those elements in and blending them in with something maybe a little bit more hard driving. Part of that streamlining and consolidation process I was talking about earlier. Foreigner, another group that's directly comparable with Boston, formed by guitarist Mick Jones and Rochester-based singer Lou Gramm. Their first album, Feels Like the First Time, from 1977, another big successful debut album, #4 on the charts. The title song, Feels Like the First Time, is a great one for hearing not only the sort of direct sort of rock and roll of the sort of Led Zeppelin influence kind of rock and roll of the group, but also the keyboards and the synthesizers and that kind of thing over the top, especially at the very beginning. Really that sort of tinkly, sort of high synthesizer sequencer kind of sound that happens over the chorus, very much influenced by progressive rock. Even more, the song Cold as Ice, the other big hit, which actually has a kind of almost classically oriented kind of center sort of section in the center of it. So again, like Boston, taking a sort of a hard driving kind of blues rock approach to music, but adding these sort of progressive rock elements to it to kind of consolidate together two styles which were relatively divided earlier in the decade. And then we come to Journey, a group that also has, we keep talking about San Francisco now, San Francisco roots. Keyboardist and vocalist Greg Raleigh and guitarist Neil Schon had played for Carlos Santana's band and broke off to form their own group, Journey. First couple of records, moderately successful, maybe a little bit, I wouldn't exactly say jam bandy, but there were some sort of progressive rock kind of tendency, certainly a lot of emphasis on the instrumental playing. But they bring in a singer by the name of Steve Perry in the middle of the decade, or towards the mid-70s. And Steve Perry has this fantastic high voice, and really, it becomes, I wouldn't say it's a different band, but really with him in the group, they have fantastic success. The album from 1978, Infinity, has got tracks on it like Lights and Feeling That Way. One of the interesting things for me about comparing, say, Journey with, say, Foreigner is how the marketing of the two groups was kind of different. Foreigner was a band that was really kind of marketed to guys. So a song like, Hot Blooded, Check It and See, Feels Like the First Time. There's not a lot of, sensitivity there. It's a kind of a bravado, sort of strutting kind of rock and roll kind of music. But Journey, on the other hand, was largely marketed to women, not in the same way that teen idols were marketed to teenagers back in the early 60s, but still marketed to women. And so Steve Perry's job was to emote a kind of sensitivity and sympathy. So you would never find, for example, Foreigner doing a song like Lovin', Touchin', Squeezin'. But from Steve Perry, somehow it seemed entirely natural. So we see even a further kind of demographic targeting going on here. This is probably fuel to those who would like to say that corporate rock was too cynically, this music was corporate rock and too cynically constructed, but nevertheless, it's important to probably point out those different emphases. See what you think, whether you think Journey and Foreigner really are contrasting in that kind of way. A couple other groups we should mention. We'll briefly say something about Cheap Trick from Rockford, Illinois, not too far from Chicago, put together by guitarist Rick Nielsen and lead vocalist Robin Zander. Here's a group that some people for a while tried to think of as, or tried to call the American Beatles. They certainly had some great success at the end of the 70s with some wonderful music. Their first big album, however, was a live album, shades of Kiss and Peter Frampton, an album called Cheap Trick at Budokan from 1979, so late in the decade, and the song I Want You to Want Me, the live version of which, it had been on a studio album earlier, but the live version of I Want You to Want Me went to number 7 and was all over the radio in 1979, 1980, still played an awful lot. They went on to do more interesting records, working with George Martin, for example, from the Beatles, producing one of their records, and a great group putting together sort of power chord guitar with fantastic sort of vocal hooks and Robin Zander's wonderful voice. Let's spend just a minute talking about Van Halen, because Van Halen actually arises in this context at the end of the 1970s. When we talk about heavy metal music in a couple of weeks, we'll come back to Van Halen and talk about them as some of the important kind of one of the sort of founding bands in the heavy metal movement that took over in the 80s. But for now, we're thinking in the context of groups like Foreigner and Boston, Cheap Trick and Journey. That's who they were sort of up against here at the end of the 1970s. That first album blended not only hard-driving rock and the virtuosic guitar playing of Eddie Van Halen, but the blues-driven vocals of David Lee Roth with a certain element of charisma that you didn't find in a lot of other groups. You listen to that first album, Van Halen, just the self-titled album from 1978, only went to number 19 in the charts at the time. Running with the Devil, the big track on that, and of course the Eruption, the Eddie Van Halen tapping guitar piece, which became a classic. We'll come back to that again when we talk to heavy metal. But when you listen to Van Halen, that first album, in fact, the whole first string of albums with David Lee Roth, people tend to think of that as being, as I say, kind of, they tend to focus on the guitars and the heavy drums. But really, focus on the singing and the vocals. These are great pop tunes. I know they rock hard, but there's a pop sensibility underneath it that really gave them a radio friendliness that allowed that music to really get played over and over and continue to get played over and over again on the radio. Well, let's continue in our next video by talking about a kind of leaner approach that we see in those musicians who are associated with progressive rock and with the singer-songwriters.